Hi, I'm Safiyya Hosein. I'm a PhD student in the Joint Communication and Culture program at Ryerson University and York University in Toronto. And I'm a comic scholar and also a comic writer as well. I recently participated in the Toronto Comics Anthology, which is on sale outside, for a short story. And one of the more interesting things about me is I was actually recently chosen as one of Vice's Humans of the Year for my research and writing. So that's what I've been doing.
Good morning, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. On a panel on authenticity, I'm forced to question whether I should lead with that salam because I'm a professor here at Barnard College, and so which hat you wear at any given time. But yes, as Zach mentioned, I teach here. I'm doing a course this semester on Muslim public culture. If any of you are looking for spring courses for next year, we're looking for people to sit in them. One of the things that Zach failed to mention, I think, with the work with the IRCPL, the Institute for Religion, Culture, Public Life, is that last year we did our first ever New York Comic Con panel, and we're hoping to do another one this coming year. So this is an ongoing interest from Columbia University to engage in this conversation and this work. I'm the contributor to an edited volume called Muslim Superheroes, and I have just finished co-editing a book on Miss Marvel and approaches to studying Miss Marvel, the first Muslim woman to headline a series for Marvel Comics. So that's sort of my background and interest in this.
Before we get started, now that introductions are out of the way, I would just like to take a quick moment to do two things. First of all, for all of us to just take a moment to think about the facilities staff and folks that maybe are not regularly thought about when we have panels like this that it takes to bring this event together, thinking about narratives and stories that are told. So I think that's important, as well as acknowledging that on a panel of authenticity, I think it's important to recognize my space as someone who is non-Muslim in this space and the honor that I feel for being allowed to be on this panel. And I think that's a good segue into sort of my first question. When I was first asked to moderate this panel, my thoughts immediately went to the theme, authenticity, and where this comes from in an etymological sense. Authenticity has a connection via the roots of the word to the author, obviously, but also authority. So I think one of the reasons why these panels today matter is because we can see from even the earliest sort of conceptions of these words that power is inextricably linked to storytelling. And when anyone tells a story, there's a relationship and a dynamic that is being mediated between storyteller and the power structures of the day. So that's sort of how I'd like to frame the conversation. So thinking about that, I'd like to pose my first question to Safiyya. So thinking about authenticity and who gets to shape the Muslim narrative, I thought it would be great to start with probably the most well-known, Miss Marvel. So maybe at a brief overview, what do you think sort of Miss Marvel and her coming onto the scene has meant for representation of Muslim women?
Miss Marvel, I like Miss Marvel. I like the introduction of Miss Marvel. I think she's definitely a role model for many young Muslims in many ways, many young Muslims and overall other Muslims who, other Muslims as well too, and people who read Miss Marvel. She's an interesting character because she's a female Muslim superhero, and normally we see Muslim women, as everybody in this room probably know, we often see them as oppressed. So very openly and I think that was the whole perspective behind Juvaria Shahid and Sana Ahmed was she's very much not like that. So she's a superhero. I find her to be still a very conservative superhero. By many standards. She's from a middle-class background. Even though we can't really define what moderate is, or secular, or religious, she would probably represent more popular conceptions of a moderate Muslim. So that's only a particular part of the community, and also too, she's Pakistani. So she doesn't represent all Muslims. There's no way you can represent all Muslims, but very much a typical representation of a Muslim and her culture as well too. So I find her to be very interesting. I find her to be a safe representation. I find it also interesting that we have so many female Muslim superheroes versus male Muslim superheroes, and I think it's very easy to portray one as a female rather than a male for many reasons. But generally speaking, I think she only represents a certain kind of Muslim.
Yeah, I think if we look at the series, if we look at the title rather than the character, I think some of that diversity element gets taken care of. You know, so her friend is Turkish descent, her sister-in-law is African American, her brother and her father and her mother all represent different types of religiosity, expressed religiosity. And I think some of that gets kept through because I don't think any one person can represent any, you know, it's not the every Muslim sort of character. And so I'm very hopeful, I'm very intrigued by the series in the ways in which it's willing to speak to and engage with some of those difficult conversations and deal with some of the ways in which one can be radicalized, but it's interesting that the people who are getting radicalized are not the Muslims, it's the people around them who are getting radicalized, right? It reminds me a lot of that James Baldwin quote, you know. He's using the N-word, but he says, you know, we never called ourselves the N-word, you called us the N-word, you needed us to exist, right? And so sort of feeling like, well, you need the Muslim terrorist because it's the way to shift that dialogue off your own terrorism. And so it feels like there's some really interesting work, mirror work, holding up that mirror that's going on in this series. And I think it's really important that it is a Muslim writer and a Muslim editor behind this series, and not because only Muslims can tell Muslim stories, because I think that's sort of derivative and insulting, I think, to good storytelling and the human experience overall. But I think it's important because there is an investment now that we haven't seen in earlier characters. Both from the direct creative side, but also from the corporate side. Because there's now somebody who's invested in this and saying, this is a story that needs to be told going back to corporate. Because I think that's an important part of the creative process as well, is this making us money? And is this piece something people like?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I want to touch on something, though, that I think is important with the idea of authenticity. And you mentioned radicalization, and I think to pull in another piece of media, something like Get Out, right? What struck me with watching the film Get Out was that no one ever uses the N-word. Again, no white person in Get Out ever uses the N-word. And I think part of what made that film so fantastic for me was the way in which it so deftly sort of captured microaggressions and gave them a tangible sense of horror, right? This feeling of being a person of color in an overwhelmingly white space. And I'd love to hear, I think that Ms. Marvel does a great job of that, of bringing the micro and making it legible on the page. And I think that's something very difficult to do. If it's something that you, via your identity, do not have access to, or something that you don't experience, how do we, as people of color, tell that story of what it's like to experience those moments? So, Safiyya, I know that you have some experience as a storyteller, obviously, and so when you're working through these things, how do you think about portraying that?
Well, when you're portraying microaggressions overall, and I've only written one story in comic format, so microaggression always requires nuance. So I think from a storytelling perspective, that's more complexity because you can't be like Jeff Johns, who portrayed Islamophobia very openly. And through the state as well too, you have to be, which is easier to do when it's very open, but when you're thinking about microaggression, you always have to think about the different characters and their subtle biases and how that can play out in a realistic way. And it's funny because Juvaria Wilson actually wrote a Tumblr post about authenticity and diversity several months back. And she just said that we should get away from the word diversity and just stick to authenticity. And one of the ways to do that is to show character nuance. So when you think of Miss Marvel, in the first issue, she's dealing with a blonde classmate who has a best friend. Miss Marvel has a best friend who's Turkish, and the blonde classmate is immediately asking her, are you forced to wear that hijab? I don't want you to be honor killed. And so that's a bit of a microaggression. It's not very openly like Jeff Johns' character, Simon Baz, who was in an offshore penal colony. So it requires nuance and complexity.
Absolutely. I think you're hitting on exactly what I was interested in, is sort of thinking about the range of experiences that people come in contact with in daily life, right? This idea of us, even though we're talking about superheroes here, there's this resistance to, in storytelling, we don't want to fall into the trap of portraying our lived experiences as sort of mustache-twirling villains, because I think, as we've so often seen in our current political moment, that racists and white supremacists often also wear suits and ties and have nicely cropped hair when they show up with tiki torches. So how do we portray this sort of spectrum? And I think Simon Baz is a really interesting example. I know from sort of our previous conversations that I think Safiyya and Professor Rashid, you have a little bit of a different take on Simon Baz as a character. So maybe Professor Rashid, if you would maybe give a little bit of a brief overview about the character, and then talk about his development.
Yeah. So Simon Baz is so Miss Marvel is part of Marvel Comics Publishing. Simon Baz is a character who's one of the Green Lanterns. Some of you may remember the Ryan Reynolds movie from a few years ago.
Or hopefully you're trying to forget.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm not recommending you go watch them. I'm saying you may remember that movie. Who's with DC Comics Publishing, which is a different comic book company. And Baz is the 5th Green Lantern we're introduced to in the storyline. Well, depending how you count, but
Yeah.
at the time, he was of Earth. Right, yeah, the Green Lanterns are Galactic Space Corps, and he's like the 5th Earth Green Lantern, although now they seem to be rewriting that history. He might end up being the 7th, we'll see. But the basic story is that he's an Arab Muslim male from Dearborn, Michigan, who is accused of terrorism. And it turns out he's actually trying to stop a bomb from going off that's been planted by a white terrorist, a white nationalist. And he gets blamed for the attack. He's put in prison, as Safiyya said. And he's written by this guy, Jeff Johns, who is from Dearborn, Michigan, who's of Arab descent, but is Christian, and is basing it on his experience with the people he grew up with. What happens is, I don't think the Simon Baz character is treated very well once Johns stops writing him. He sort of disappears with no explanation. He just is there one issue and he's not there the next. And it's very clear when John stops writing him. And then he's reintroduced in a team book. He's there called the Justice League of America. He's there for maybe 6 issues. Again, not a prominent character. He disappears. He's now been reintroduced in a book called The Green Lanterns, where he's training a new Green Lantern, the first Earth female Green Lantern.
Jessica Cruz.
Jessica Cruz, thank you. I knew her last name because I can't remember her first name. Jessica Cruz. And there, his religion is totally erased from his character. So not that he's a-religious, but it's not, whereas it was an important part of who he was when Johns was writing him, it really, his Arab identity gets forefronted. And the fact that he eats mamul as opposed to chocolate chip cookies, It's like, isn't that strange and exotic and funny? And no, it's a cookie, it's yummy, it's delicious, like, move on. There's other parts of the story to tell here. And so, yeah, I'm not a big fan of the way Baz has been presented. And I don't think his character has really developed over the 5 years he's been introduced.
So I think that's a little bit of a long take on the character development. I'm interested in maybe diving into a few of the specifics around Simon Baz's origin story. I think the way in which, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Professor Rashid, but I do think that there's something interesting. For those of you who aren't familiar in sort of DC Comics lore, and this is by no means a deep dive into DC Comics lore, we'll be here all day, but the Green Lantern, what a lot of folks don't realize, they're essentially space cops, right? Like, that's what they are. They're organized into these precincts. That's more or less exactly what they're called. And so even the idea that we have this male Muslim character who takes on this identity of this intergalactic enforcer of justice, I think is really interesting. But what their powers are fueled by is actually willpower. Each of the Green Lanterns and a number of other sort of these characters, the Yellow Lanterns, they're all fueled by different emotions. And willpower is what fuels the Green Lanterns. And when the ring of power sort of comes to him, it seeks him out. They're like these little homing beacons to find people who are worthy. It's actually when he is being confronted by these two sort of racist police officers who are trying to pin him for this terrorist act. And he is subduing, it's a really beautiful scene, he's subduing all of his rage and sort of anger towards the situation that he's been presented with and found himself in. And it's this emancipatory moment where the ring comes to him and flies in, sort of busts through the wall, if I remember, and announces in front of everyone that Simon Baz, like of Earth, you know, you are worthy to wield the power of Green Lantern. And what that meant for me, reading the story, even though I'm not Muslim, thinking about the way, as someone who's of Mexican background, the way in which our people are demonized in relationships with police as well, of what it means to have this moment of emancipation, of recognition, of the willpower and the strength that it requires just to live through these daily moments. Obviously, not everyone comes in contact with police in this sort of way, but recognizing these sort of moments and the power that it takes. So I'd love if you could maybe speak a little bit more to his origin story and what you find compelling about it, Safiyya.
Well, his origin story is the only story I've read. I haven't read the Justice League ones as well. I agree that his character is not very well developed, but I actually was impressed enough with the story that it dealt very openly with Islamophobia, which is something that feels like Juvaria Wilson and Sana Amanat, the creators of Ms. Marvel, sort of evade in some ways. Not very. They do deal with it, but his was about specifically how he's discriminated as a Muslim male by the state. And I find that the Green Lantern, which is really the only more popular Muslim male superhero that we know in mainstream comics here, I find it very interesting that he only came in for that brief time, because if we were to actually feature a Muslim male superhero, then we would have to deal very openly with his vulnerability to torture, to being branded as a terrorist, being branded as a radical as well. And I feel that's very important to see. Also, even though he wasn't really very much a believable Muslim character, I mean, his name is Simon. That's obviously not a common Muslim name, but I feel as though I really felt that it was very necessary to have a Muslim male superhero in that perspective, and the whole Green Lantern origin story was more like an American story, and this showed. I find it very interesting that he was even at one point hunted by the Justice League in that origin story. So even these people we look up to, the Justice League, Superman, all of those superheroes, even they were stereotyping him. So it really dealt very openly with how discriminated Muslims are in this day and age. And so that's the reason why I liked that origin story.
You know, it's funny because for me, I think that dealing with Islamophobia is important. But I felt that the way the story dealt with it was so heavy-handed.
Yes.
There wasn't a sense of
nuance,
right? It was just like, I mean, if you wanted to do a thing on this is what structural racism looks like, you could do it in 2 pages. They did it for 3 issues, and it felt like, stop already. Like, give us some resolution, give us a way to move beyond this impasse. Otherwise, it's yes, everybody's racist. We accept that. Maybe we don't accept it. That's actually probably a more fundamental problem, but. How do you, and that's really where I struggle with it, is it felt like an after-school special rather than a good story. Some after-school specials have really good stories, but this wasn't one of them.
So if I could maybe jump in, I think that's an interesting question though, right? To come back to this idea, this is not necessarily like a microaggression or something that people sort of experience within the atmosphere of living and moving through space. as being othered individuals. But the question of how, because I am interested in this idea that, well, oh, we know everyone's racist, okay. Is that something that we know? Especially thinking about conversations that are happening in the comic book industry of people, you know, yelling and claiming sort of, what is this diversity? Like, why do you need all these people of color? Why do you need to be talking about these issues? Why do you have politics in our comics? You know, you mentioned Miss Marvel and the sales factor. Do you think that part of why it's, I think Miss Marvel is a wonderfully told story, but I think this question of would it be doing as well if it was openly talking about Islamophobia in the types of ways that Green Lantern was? Do you think that that's something that people would be wanting to hear, or is this idea that Kamala Khan is the 21st century Spider-Man, this everyday, you know, Peter Parker that everyone can relate to? Is that something that is important purely because there's less of a challenge of the state and of structural systems?
Well, so I think it doesn't have to be an either-or option. So I think one of the things that I have problems with the Green Lantern Islamophobia thing is it doesn't get us to a resolution. The scene that you mentioned at the beginning of Miss Marvel, where Zoe, the blonde-haired woman, comes in and says to Nakia, the Turkish best friend, "Are you going to be honor killed?" As you right? It has to be explained to Kamala Khan, who's the Miss Marvel character, why this isn't actually Zoe being nice. And so as a reader, we're told what a microaggression is without being lectured as to what a microaggression is. And then we're offered throughout the course of that issue a way through that space, or how that space is contested and challenged. Perhaps we don't get to a full resolution, but we see the ways in which it's contested. I don't think we ever get that with the Green Lantern. I think that, not the most recent arc, but the second to most recent arc, where Amir, Kamala Khan's brother, and Miss Marvel runs to a mosque to hide out, we see some of the direct interaction with Islamophobia. But I think we also have to understand the cultures of the two comic book houses, and I think that's why it's important, the difference between Marvel and DC, is that DC is always, not always, but has traditionally been much more about the male lone hero who works by himself, the notable exception being Wonder Woman, and they have some sort of tragedy, and they're brooding, and they want to punch things really hard until the problem gets fixed, right? Like there's not a lot of ways in which it's about community and building, and it's very sort of direct. They don't deal with nuance and algorithm. Well, I'm not a big DC fan, in case that's not clear. You know, I think Marvel has always specialized in allegory. It's what I think, in terms of, if you think about it as a mechanism for social change, I think what Marvel does is far more effective, which is don't deal with the issue head on, allegorize it to the effect that people create sympathy with fictional characters that can then be transplanted into the real world, because it's very hard to generate sympathy for real people if you're not actually empathetic. And we see that with certain people with small hands, that there's a direct correlation between lack of empathy and size of one's hands. So, you know.
As I hide my hands. Safiyya, do you have any comments on that?
I think that's actually a very interesting way to look at it. Resolve from a storytelling perspective is very important. From a creative perspective, as a writer, I can tell that, and that's why possibly Simon Baz doesn't feel as authentic to Dr. Rashid, and I can understand that. But I felt DC is not very good with showcasing social change and social justice, as you just noted. But I felt the fact that there wasn't a resolve this one time was very important, because there hasn't really been a resolution to that form of Islamophobia yet. And so therefore, I'm not thinking, oddly enough, even though I'm a writer as well too, I'm not thinking specifically from a fictional perspective at this point. I think the fact that it was left open and not resolved actually in some way committed some kind of call for social change, or call, like, not necessarily call, but like it probably really impacted the reader, at least for me, that there wasn't a resolve to the types of Islamophobia that he felt and that he experienced.
Right, and so when I say resolution, I don't mean a conclusion or a solution, but there has to be some contestation, right? And I don't feel like there was a way.
Yeah, it was left open.
There was no signaling, you know, what this could look like or ways we could move. Right? It was just sort of Either you're Islamophobic or you're not Islamophobic, and those are the two ends. But there's no.
Yeah, there wasn't any in between, and there wasn't a spectrum.
And how do you move from one end to the other?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's where I'm having the issue.
I think, though, I would maybe disagree in the sense that I think it's important that, Safiyya, you bring up that even the Justice League is hunting Simon Baz when he's first sort of introduced. And I think in some way we see our heroic figures come to a bit of that realization. I think maybe they're intended within that storyline, eventually as they see what Simon Baz has done, and there's more of a move towards an acceptance, right?
Mm-hmm.
The heroic figures are playing the heroes here, right? They are showing us maybe a better way forward, I think. I think maybe that's, for me at least, that was sort of where I found that resolution, was in thinking through that. But I would like to get back on sort of the history of the two houses, right? I found it really interesting you were saying, Professor Rashid, that we have to allegorize things because it's hard to empathize with real people. I wonder if you could say more about that, because that's something I've been really trying to think through, is why is it that we are so comfortable with sort of figures of resistance, figures of revolution, people who are working through oppression, in a fantastical sense, in a science fiction sense, but we struggle so much when we're confronted with it in real life.
Yeah.
And why do you think that allegory is necessary?
So I want to really emphasize that point you're making. We're very comfortable with Martin and Malcolm now that they're dead, but God forbid we do anything with Opal Tometi for Black Lives Matter, right? Like these were people. Muhammad Ali went from being the most hated man in America to lighting the Olympic torch in 1996, right? To millions of people watching or attending his funeral last year. And so that transformation happens once they've affected the change, but the process of change is something we hate, we can't stand. Because we can't imagine that Black lives have any meaning in this country. It's a problem for us, right? Look, I don't want to make it sound like I'm denigrating the survivors of Parkland, that's not what I'm doing. But Oprah gives $500,000 to say that these kids' lives matter, but not one penny is going to Black Lives Matter. This is what structural racism looks like, right? And we cannot valorize the things that we find that would challenge our status quo of understanding of the world, right? And I think this is where allegory is so important. This is like things like Star Trek, the fictional world, Star Trek, comic books, fiction have proven so effective because it allows us to create that sense of empathy, that sense of connection that we then lose. And sell these with the idea that they're going to be the ones that are going to drive your billion-dollar company. You sell these with the idea that they keep customers invested between Avengers movies, right? And between now hopefully better X-Men movies. And so I think you have that sort of, and we see this in cycles, right? One Day at a Time is back on television. Choreography for the Straight Guys back on television on Netflix.
Well, just Queer Eye now.
Is it just Queer Eye?
Yeah, it's just Queer Eye. They're expanding the market.
There's a new Star Trek, right? 70 years we're still watching Star Trek. Star Wars is back. Like, it's all these things that are coming back in cycles, and I think you now have a media behemoth behind them that are capitalizing on it. So I think it's more, there's a cyclical issue here. And you now have fans who are now writing this, like Sana talks about growing up and reading this stuff. And Willow Wilson and
Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? One of the sort of most prolific writers on race in America today. Speaks very openly about being a comic book fan and growing up and reading these sorts of things, and now he's writing the Black Panther comic and has been for a couple of years. I think these things matter certainly in the way that these ideas clearly stick with folks. Barack Obama talking about how he read Spider-Man growing up, and I think, not to play amateur psychologist to steal one of your lines, Professor Rashid, but I think it's clear to see how this idea of I'm just out here for the little guy, right? Like, I'm here to make sure that everyone gets a fair shake, this sort of Spider-Man mantra, with great power comes great responsibility. Maybe that always wasn't portrayed in President Barack Obama's policy, but I think in some ways we can see connections there. So I think there is this sense that comic books can be a breeding ground for moral and ethical exploration, as I've said before. And I want to just highlight, thinking about the history a little bit for folks who aren't familiar with how sort of the American style of comics and American superheroes came to be. they're really born out of the oppression and discrimination of Jewish Americans. Is really where pretty much all of our most prolific comic book creators, early comic book creators, come from. You basically had, back in the 1930s, 40s, you had a lot of Jewish Americans who, at that time, were considered second-class citizens. They were had these degrees. They had been illustrators and writers and wanted to go do something else, but nobody would give them a job except for these comic book guys because it was kid stuff. You know, it didn't matter. It was sort of this seedy business at the time. Had incredibly well-educated folks working in a medium that was the only one that they had access to, and they're the folks who gave us Captain America. They're the folks who gave us Batman, who gave us Superman. Superman was originally, you know, the idea of a young boy growing up in rural Ohio?
Kansas.
No, not Kansas. He did grow up in Kansas. Superman grew up in Kansas.
Is that what you just said?
Yeah, but sorry. Anyway, the creator of Superman, I believe, was Ohio. Yeah. And Superman was originally created as an idea of someone who was going to protect him from the bullies at lunch. You know, this story of rising up against oppression and discrimination is something that is baked into the history of comic books. So when we're talking about politics, when we're talking about challenging narratives, I would encourage you all to look it up. There's one of the most famous sort of comic book images, in my opinion, of Captain America punching Hitler square in the jaw. And it's sort of this iconic image, but the story behind that, a lot of people don't realize, people now, as we're 60, 70 years removed, think that, oh, this was part of all the propaganda comics that came out at the time during the war. That issue actually came out 6 months before the United States entered into the World War II conflict. That in itself was a political statement. These were Jewish creators making a claim on sort of moral decency and the necessity to act. And so what we find is that these places of comics have always been about challenging these narratives. So think about, as we move forward, what do you think are the kinds of comics that you think need to be coming out, that you think, if you could sort of pitch a book, you know, what would you want to be tackling right now? What do you think is the direction that comic books need to be moving in? What's the issue that needs to be tackled today?
The reason that it's so easy to do this allegory, this work through allegory, is because there are only so many ways we can hate on other people. And so if you read a book now that was written in the 1980s, we read it as being an allegory for Muslims, right? We can sort of do it backwards. But at the time, it was much more racially centered or allegorized through race. And then we jump ahead like 5 or 6 years, and it's much more about questions of sexuality. But again, it can still easily be about Latinos if we read it today. The ways in which we create others. And so I think that allegorical method is there, and it reflects the society in which we're in. You know, what I would love to see is, and I think coming back to this point, the issues I have with the Green Lantern is, but what does the future look like, right? Again, I bring up Star Trek where, oh, we've gotten rid of racism and sexism, and that's wonderful, but what happened in the middle to get us there, right? Like, what's the 10-year window that we're looking at? So we're not writing the same stories, right? That somebody who picks up a comic book that was written 40 years ago isn't saying, oh, this is my experience today, even though it wasn't about that, right? Can we actually grow as a people? What does that look like for us to grow in a way that says, oh, this isn't going to happen to Sikhs and Hindus in 20 years from now? How do we have that way forward? What does that look like? So, you know, I think Afrofuturism gave us a window of what some of that could look like from a racial lens, but it was never that big. Wakanda was the closest to it, that sort of big investment behind it. So what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? I think those would be some of the things I'd love to see happen.
Yeah, I definitely think, because you're talking about dystopian realities, and I definitely see a lot of room there in dystopian realities to expand on racism and Islamophobia. I recently bought a book, a collection of stories called Iraq Plus 100, and apparently it's quite popular. And this is a regular a collection of short stories from different Iraqi writers as well, and now it's starting to become more popular, and other Arab writers want to write more about that, like Palestine Plus 100, other writers want to do that. And the only thing I was thinking when I was looking at Iraq Plus 100 was it would be interesting to do something like Islam Plus 100, like what Muslim realities can look like 100 years from now, and have short story contributions as well too. But that's a dystopian world as well too. So I think dystopian fiction overall in comics would continue to be very productive for allegory and also too for challenging racism and Islamophobia and sexism. I really like autobiographical comics. Life narratives, they seem to be very popular.
Like even if it's imaginary and fictional and on the screen, like people need that kind of reformation, like to see that. So I think it gets more complicated with Islam and Muslims because of the narratives that are constructed around us. But how do you all think that a story that shows Muslims having that much power, and I guess this might relate to some of your points about like a male Muslim superhero versus a female Muslim superhero. So how can we, and do you think like it's tangible to imagine a story in a similar way that represents like an imaginary, powerful, joyful, hopeful, utopian kind of community of Muslims?
I think it's out there. The question is, how do we recognize, because there's also an aesthetic quality as well, and there's a lot out there that's not good. And so how do we not just promote everything that's by Muslims and about Muslims, right, unconditionally, and sort of say, no, there are really good stories out there. Willow Wilson's written Aleph the Unseen, before I forget that one, which is another sort of fantasy world. Again, but very Muslim-centric. And so I think they exist out there. These are the ones I'm reading. I'm sure there's hundreds I'm forgetting right now. You can probably chime in with them. But, I think they do exist. We have to make sure that they sort of get out there and get right. What I'd love to do at some point is offer a seminar on American Muslim women writers here. But I need student support for that. So, Mariam, I can maybe put that on the MSA agenda, to get that course happening. So.
Larger, more dominant culture around them as well too. I know my last point before was about how we're mainly seeing Arab and Middle Eastern superheroes and also 2 South Asian superheroes, and you'd mentioned Black Muslims are very much, we need to see more focus on Black Muslims and different cultures of Muslims overall. Each culture practices Islam and looks at Islam very differently. And then there are different levels of religiosity. So I would have to say if we had to have a utopian world, there would have to be representation of different types of Muslims and acceptance of all of them and acknowledgement of all of them as Muslim.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'd like to take maybe one more question if we have time. Yeah, absolutely.
This was a really fascinating conversation and sort of, to what Hussein was saying, one of the great things about this space, the Muslim supported here, and I think some of those really interesting conversations started here, so it says something to the work of the Columbia MSA and the group that's been involved.
Find someone, if you're not an artist, write and put your story out there and work with your friends to get the kind of support that you need to make it happen. And there are all sorts of resources out there for that. That doesn't immediately answer the question, right?
I guess my point is to put on the table something that we all know, is that there is a structural disinvestment in Muslim cultural production or Islamic cultural production.
Yes.
And I think often without placing that up front and saying that we have real kind of, there's a real vacuum of sort of institutional and structural support for cultivating generations of cultural producers, not in one particular way, but in many ways.
So I have yes and no. I think that yes, there needs to be more financial investment. At the same time, where does this financial investment come from? Being in New York, there are a lot of foundations who are willing to throw money at Muslims, but they have to perform in certain ways, and in ways that the foundations would understand, which often actually presuppose, well, our job as creators or artists is to combat Islamophobia. Well, no, actually that's not actually the job of the artist. It may be a task for the arts, but it's not actually what the arts do, right? And there's a certain expectation of performativity that has to happen. There also has to be a question of who's funding this, a cultural funding from within Muslim communities. I've been involved with several high-profile projects that have been for the benefit of the Muslim community, where we could not get serious funding for the Muslim community because the arts aren't just something you fund, right? If I can't get my name on a building or a big shout out on somebody's web, like we would give you a big shout out on the webpage, but you know, like there has to be some sort of more permanent, consistent recognition. And then the flip side of that is it's not top down; it's also bottom up. Like, what is the Muslim community? Because what do Muslims communities recognize as being authentically Muslim? To come back to this question of authenticity, I don't think that you will find people running around. In fact, I can tell you numerous stories, but where I say, you know, what's the introduction to Islam book that you want people to read? I give them the first volume of Miss Marvel, and they're like, no, you should be giving them the Quran. And I'm like, no, that's actually probably the worst introduction to Islam I can give them, because it's not a story. People want stories, right? It's not a knock on the Quran, it's the way people want to engage. And people say, no, she doesn't wear hijab, or she's Pakistani, or she doesn't speak proper Arabic, or, you know, it's like, hey, she's a fictional character, she's not actually talking. But it's also like, what do you want people to know and understand, right? And so I think that there has to be an understanding of the diversity of ways it means to be Muslim. I think Safiyya's point to this. It has to come from within the community as well, because otherwise you don't get those diverse stories. Yeah. And there has to be a commitment to funding that sense of diversity, right? We're not funding theological institutes. We're funding stories of our lives. And our lives are really diverse and really complex.
Yeah, sorry, and I'll leave it to Safiyya to close. But I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name, but Miriam, who opened this up, and the other organizers have mentioned that the reason why narratives are partially so important is because this idea that Muslims and many, sort of minority communities are shaped as monoliths, and part of reclaiming and working against the dehumanization that has happened is completely, allowing ourselves to hold on to this notion that to be human is to be fully realized. To be a person is to be a fully realized human, and that means that there are all these complexities, there are all these messy sort of things, there are inconsistencies, there are contradictions, and I think that we need to work, within our communities, but also then project outwards that, Miss Marvel is one narrative, Simon Baz is one narrative. These are all one narratives, and part of why representation matters is because it's not that anyone is speaking in a unified voice, that this is what Muslims are, but rather with every new voice that's added, it's a new possibility for people to see themselves reflected, and for society, it chips away at that monolith. Every single narrative that is told chips away at that monolith and says, no, it can also be this thing. It can also be that. And that we're not bound into one image that's convenient or easy to look at.
My first point to that one, and I'm addressing this to everyone, if you really do actually want to support Muslim writers in the comic industry, there was a Kickstarter project recently that's ended. It's called Habibi, and it's a collection written in zine format. I know there's a zine making workshop later on by a bunch of Muslim comic creators, and it's called Habibi, and it's being published by Bedside Press. I think people already backed it, and I don't know if you can buy more copies, but I do know of it, and I bought the digital version because I'm excited, because I really wanted to see how Muslim women represent themselves in each chapter. But to go to Dr. Rashid's point, I couldn't agree with him more that the entire community doesn't seem, I think overall, to really invest a lot in arts, and I think that comes from perhaps the fact that we're primarily a first-generation immigrant community, where our parents, not my parents, I'm doing communications, but and my dad's here, but so he can attest to this, that our parents sort of more pressure us to go into the sciences. There's such an emphasis on the sciences, and you know, there's just not a lot of engagement about arts with arts in our community, and that's why I find symposiums like this to be very, very encouraging, because really and truly there's a sense of erasure in the arts community overall, even at an indie level where Muslims are concerned. Like I live in downtown Toronto, and I think it's just something with immigrant communities. As soon as I go to an arts council workshop, it's just so overwhelmingly white. So I don't think there's a lot of engagement in the arts in our community, and I really feel like there should be more of a focus on a building towards that. Even with comic scholarship, a lot of the times people are like, well, why are you looking at Muslims in popular culture? We should be looking at radicalization or terrorism, or how we're portrayed in journalism, and there's always like a kind of denigration of looking at us in popular culture, even though, as Dr. Rashid said, popular culture is really what informs, especially non-Muslims, what the Muslim community is. And so there needs to be more of a push and a focus in that industry, and it can start with places like Kickstarter. It can start with indie publishing houses or web comics as well too. I think if we had more of that and then we promoted from the bottom up, I think that we could really do a lot for changing perceptions of this community.
Sorry, I know you wanted her to have the last word, but I just want to shout something out. Excuse me. To your point of shouting things out, and to the original question about joy, I do want to mention the podcasting panel that's happening here, which is Zara Norbaksh, Magali Ikhlas Salib, Unbridled Joy, their creators. Go support them, show up at the panel, make sure are they here, by the way, right now? Okay, I just want to be on record that I am not showing up for them if they didn't show up for me. Gotta get out there. But you should all show up for them and support them. If you want to talk about roles of unbridled joy, they are the place to be.
Thank you, everyone. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.